RMC is supported by MonsterJoysticks.com. Level up your retro gaming with their joysticks featuring genuine Sanwa arcade parts. And OneClickPrint.com for your photos on canvas, acrylic, gifts and more. Local craftsmen and global delivery. Hello Cave Dwellers, welcome into the cave. Today I'm joined by Keith from the Digital Orphanage because recently we made a video together for you called 5 Rare British Micros, in which we showed you, well, 5 rare British micros of course, and we invited you to tell us which you wanted to see more of, didn't we Keith?
That's right, and overwhelmingly you said the Memotech MTX512.
And I'm really not surprised that you chose that machine. It's such a good looking machine. The Enterprise 128 was a close second, so I expect we'll see that again on the channel soon. But today we're really focusing in on the MTX512. We're discovering it ourselves today. We've spent the morning experimenting, loading games into it, going through the user guide and trying examples and learning some of the very interesting features and an interesting programming language in particular that we weren't expecting to find that's built into the machine. So we've discovered a lot. We want to share that with you today, so that's what we're going to do. Before we do, let's just have a quick recap on exactly what the machine is, and then we'll tell you about our findings, and also we'll look at some really interesting peripherals that Keith has found from the archives of the Swindon Museum of Computing, and we've got just over here. So we've got a lot to get through and look at today. So let's have that quick recap on what the Memotech MTX512 is. This was the creation of Robert Branton and Jeff Boyd, who met in Oxford, which, alongside Cambridge, was a melting pot of technology ideas and spawned many computer startups in the 80s. Memotech built its war chest making peripherals for the Sinclair ZX81. Memory expansions were particularly popular. But when Sinclair started releasing machines with more RAM on board, they turned their attention to building their own micro, which released in 1983. And what a looker it is! Brushed aluminium is the order of the day, and it looks as good today as it did 37 years ago. If you think it looks familiar and you're not sure why, it's the machine that was used in the movie Weird Science to hack into the Pentagon. Inside the 512 we find 64K of RAM, the lesser MTX 500 has 32K as standard, which could be extended to a whopping 768K, and there's 24K of ROM. The CPU is a Zilog Z80A running at 4MHz, and dedicated chips for video and sound by Texas Instruments complete a spec that's not dissimilar to the MSX standard of micros which appeared in this year. Ports are plentiful, including various video outputs, a cassette port, 2 joystick ports, parallel ports and a cartridge slot on the side, with space internally for an optional communications board for 2 RS-232 interfaces and a disk drive bus. So there's a quick recap for you. Now let's dive straight in and actually see some software running on this thing. Keith has chosen a selection of software for us today while we chat about it. What's the first program that you've picked?
Well, Neil, the first game is 3D Tachyon Fighter from Continental Software, made in 1984 and by a gentleman called Andy Key. And that's a name we're going to see a lot of because he did a lot of software for the Memotech back in the day. Back in the day and in the present day, as we'll discover. He's quite the name in Memotech circles. I don't imagine that to be a very big circle, but he's quite the name in that circle. So tell us about this game, because I was quite impressed with this. We think this one is based on the 1982 Sega game of Buck Rogers and the Planet of Zoom. It's very similar. It's obviously not identical, given the difference between an arcade and the Memotech, and it heavily uses hardware sprites. Bearing in mind this is a machine from 1983, the game was 1984. So the competition back then, we're looking at, well, in the business market, the IBM PC, but we'll come back to that because we're looking at a game here at the moment. So in the UK, the ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, BBC Micro, Dragon 32, so many micros available in the UK at that time. How do you think it holds up against those game-wise, looking at this? I think the hardware sprites give it an edge over certain machines like the Spectrum and the BBC. Makes it feel like a Commodore 64 in that sense.
Yeah, I think I need to see a few more examples before I could say that this is in competition with the Commodore 64, but I'm impressed with what I've seen so far. It's smooth, there's no flickering, there's no colour clash that I can see on this game, and it's enjoyable to play, which is the most important thing. This machine was designed to appeal to the home users, but Memotech did want it to have an air of quality, which I think it does have when compared to the sub £100 Sinclair micros. It was pitched at a more serious home user, and a few of you, as you always do on these videos, will say, why are you showing us games? Because it was designed for more than games. But I just find that games are a really good way to touch on all of the hardware in the machine, to see exactly what it's capable of.
Indeed, and this machine, because they've cut out a lot of the additional 80 column mode electronics, is more geared for that home market, where all the things we're going to look at, you can then bolt on and make it into more of a business machine.
Yeah, to bring it into competition with something like the IBM PC. Now, this was born out of a machine called the SM1, which was a project to build a low-cost computer for video digitizing. The MTX would be a cut-down version of that, with the more expensive parts taken out. And in an interview with a popular website, The Register, I'm sure plenty of you read that, Jeff Boyd, who is the co-creator of the machine, said that instead of building the machine from the bottom up to be a low-cost computer, they started with the full spec, everything they wanted, and then worked it down to cost. So it was a slightly different approach to the way, say, Sir Clive Sinclair went about creating his machines. But they did leave you the ability to then bring it back up to closer to the spec of the SM1 with various upgrades. So I think we should grab some of those upgrades to show people, Keith. And while we're doing that, let's load up the second piece of software. What was the second game that you had for us?
So the second game is Little Devils.
Little Devils. We'll get that loaded up. Just tell us quickly how you're loading these, because are these cassette tapes originally?
These would have been either cassette tapes, or some of them have been converted into cassette tapes by obviously the scene back in at some point in the 2000s. But these I'm loading via a little netbook that I've got hanging around. So that's just wave sounds coming out of the earphone.
Yeah, so you found a workaround to get it working today. Okay, let's get that loaded up, and then we're going to grab some of these peripherals to show you, because there's some impressive kit. So the table is fully loaded. We're going to take you through as much as we can. My first impression, just taking all of this out of the boxes, is how good it all looks. The machine itself was gorgeous, and that style follows through into everything. It's all brushed aluminium. Some of it was a bit grubby, but it cleaned up straight away with just a squirt of WD-40, because it's brushed aluminium. It's lovely. It cleans up and it looks like new. Anyway, Keith, what was that second program that you put on for us?
The second game was Little Devils from Syntax Software, made by a gentleman called Mark Lawrence. Not sure what year this was from, but I figure more 84 again.
Yeah, okay. And this was a puzzler, but quite a fast-paced puzzler with a lot of familiar feeling about it, wasn't it?
It did. It kind of reminded me of a little bit of Bomberman, a little bit of Pac-Man, and then some of those sliding puzzle games.
There was a bit of Pengu, maybe even a bit of Mr. Do in there, but it's hard to say which came out first, whether this game was a copy of those. It's all a bit muddled in my mind, because I don't know exactly what year did this game come out. Do we know?
No, we don't know. It doesn't say.
84, 85. Yeah. It feels like a lot of games of the time, but it has its own unique feel at the same time. I enjoyed it. I went back for quite a few goes on that, and it was fast. And again, there was no flickering. It looked good. It played well. We were able to play all of these games with the Monster Joystick Mini, just a standard DE9 interface, isn't it? So yeah, it was great. It is turning into quite a fun gaming machine, but it's not all about the gaming, which is why there are all of these accessories. So where should we start, Keith? Let's go over there. We've got the standard cassette deck over there. So this is what you would have loaded your games with originally. There's nothing particularly special about a cassette deck, but this is a Memotech branded one. So would this have come with it, or would you have bought that as an extra?
Not sure.
Not sure.
It probably would have been most of the time, to keep the price point of this machine as low as possible, these would have been extras.
Yeah. I said the styling followed through on everything, but actually, of everything, that's quite a cheap looking thing. It's just a plain black plastic, isn't it?
I believe this is a badged version of an existing tape deck that's out
Right.
there.
Yeah.
And it can run off battery or a mains adapter.
Okay.
So.
Nothing too exciting, but it's, it's part of the whole setup. You probably would have had that. Now you've got something else there, which I haven't seen before.
So we've got a few items that didn't come from the museum. They've come from a friend of the museum, Phil, and he's allowed me to bring in some bits today. And this is a item called Memo Talk, which plugs in the side to the expansion port and allows you to do speech synthesis.
Okay, so do we know, is that the Texas Instruments speech chip in there that a lot of them had at the time?
That's a good question, Neil, and one I really do not know on this one because I've only picked it up today.
Okay, looking in the box, it's called the Speak Easy Speech Synthesizer, easy for me to say. And looking at the manual, it works on a system of allophones in exactly the same way as the Cheetah Sweet Talker that we saw on the channel did recently, and the same numbers for the same allophones when issuing data commands to it. So it's going to be exactly the same speech chip in there, but it doesn't have a built-in speaker in there. It has a phono out, so that's a bit nicer. You can merge it with the audio output of the machine and actually control the volume, which is something I couldn't do with the Sweet Talker. But you found something else in there, haven't you?
Yes, there's an invoice in here and dated the 21st of September 1987. Bought from Orion Software in Burnley, if that was your local shop. And it cost £13.87 plus the VAT.
Wow, and they've also bought some other software. So they've bought the SDK Disk Controller, SDX, that's this here. What else have they bought?
A self-test.
Don't know what that is,
and Football Manager.
Football Manager. You think it's Kevin Tom's Football Manager? Because he did write Kevin Tom's Football Manager for every single platform going. I wouldn't be surprised if it was on here.
And apparently they had to wait for their cover. The cover was to follow.
Cover to follow.
So did you get your cover when you bought it?
Yeah, so that's a fun add-on. And as we mentioned on the receipt there, the SDX controller. So tell us about that. That's this one here.
So this is the Generation 1 SDX controller.
It clearly slots onto the side expansion here.
And then you could get either the 5¼ inch or the 3.5 inch disk drive to go on it.
Okay, so these both run off the same controller. So you've got 5¼ 3.5 inch.
So that's the second version, and where the drive is built into the unit. So the 3.5 inch on there would have been connected.
Oh, sorry, I see. Yeah, so this slots straight onto the edge. So that's got the that's all in one. That's neater. I like that, and higher capacity as well.
And there's also an optional memory that can go into there, which can act as I believe, like a silicon disk as well. Okay,
like a RAM disk. Okay, and speaking of memory, the reason this is called the MTX512 is because you can take it all the way up to 512k of RAM, which was huge in 1983. The Amiga 1000 didn't even have that when it came out in 85. So we've got the side expansion port here, but there's also another expansion port on the other side inside into which you could install this. Is that correct?
So what we have here are two cards. We have the memory expansion.
Okay, which isn't fully populated, so you could more than we've got on here.
I'm not too sure how much that one is. I think that might be another 128k on that one.
Okay.
But we'll need to have a look. And the additional expansion on the top is the combined serial, and also the very long connection along the top is to connect to this bad boy. Okay.
So you've got a couple of rows of header pins here. I think we're missing the long cable, aren't we? That goes
well,
with
we're missing two things. So there's a short cable that goes to and the connectors for the serial, the 25-pin connectors that would go on the back. So I'll need to create something there. Thankfully, all the wiring diagrams exist. And then you've got a 60-way cable, which is effectively this expansion bus.
Right.
And then that allows a large cable to go to connect to this bad boy.
Okay, so you're sort of piggybacking a third expansion off into this. And as you say, it would give you a couple of RS-232 ports as we slowly build the spec of the MTX MTX512 back up to what the SM1 was that we mentioned earlier. But there's still more to come because we plug this in, and I think this deserves to. Well, how would it have worked? Would you put the machine in front of it and the monitor on top? Is that what
that's how I've seen
for?
It? Effectively. You know.
Okay. I want to see it in situ properly. So let's sit this in front of this. Let's clear the decks a little bit more, and let's see what this bad boy is. I think this looks absolutely gorgeous. The machine on its own was good looking enough as it was, but it's too much for one man to handle. Look at it, Keith. And you may actually think that you recognise this if you're a movie buff, because this appeared in a film, didn't it?
It did.
Speaking of good-looking things.
If you grew up in the 80s and you're a teenager, this was a film you wanted to watch, which was Weird Science.
Weird Science. Do you reckon we might be able to have a go at creating our own dream lady?
Can we?
Let's have a go.
Hello, cave dwellers.
Delete it. Thank you very much to Derek Findus for being a good sport there. But yeah, anyway, back to the machine. This isn't just a couple of extra floppy drives that we've added on. There's a lot more to it than that, isn't there?
Correct. I believe it's a continuation of the Z80 data bus. So you've got that 60-way cable coming into the bottom of here, and then you've got a back plane at the front, which then gives you space for additional cards, and this one's already got a couple in it. It's got the floppy drive controller to do the two built-in control floppy drives, and then it's also got the 80 column card and then a video output for the back.
Which was really important, really, for those business customers. It's made it a much more serious machine than the competitors. It allowed you to use CPM with the floppy drives. And CPM was quite important when it came to the Soviets, wasn't it? Because there was an embargo which meant computers were banned from going to the USSR. But there was a kind of a loophole where if it ran CPM, it could get past that embargo. And the Soviets will come into the story of the MTX a little bit more as we talk about its demise later on. But just be aware that it could run CPM, and that 80 column card made it a much more serious machine. But I imagine the cost of all of this is starting to stack up. So we took a little break there to see another piece of software running. What was that, Keith?
That was a game called Astropack, which you'd be not forgiven for saying looked very similar to Jetpack.
Yes, yeah. And I had quite an extended play on this because I'm a big fan of Jetpack. It was fun. It wasn't quite up there with Ultimate's original game. At times it almost felt a little bit like Frogger. It was less frantic. And then the way you had to kind of work your way back down the screen, because when you flew over the rocket in the original game, you would drop the piece onto the rocket. You had to actually go down and deliver it to the rocket in this game. So then working your way down the screen past all of these enemies was kind of Frogger-like.
So Frogger with a gun.
Frogger with a gun, yeah. It was still fun. It was just different. So who was that game by?
So that was by Andy Key again.
Andy Key again, that name again.
Indeed, and it was under the Continental Software, which was Memotech's own in-house brand. So there are more than Andy who were published under that, but he was the main person who seems to have really got into
But you don't
machine.
see your Mastertronics, you don't see your Codemasters, do you, associated with the MTX?
There is... and I was trying to figure out whether this was published at the time or whether it was done afterwards as a kind of conversion, but there was Soul of a Robot.
Oh, yes.
Did you ever remember that one?
Yeah.
And that was by Mastertronic.
Okay, so they
it's
did.
quite neat.
Yeah. I know companies like that, they'd bring out one or two titles for systems like the Dragon 32
Almost
and then nothing else.
Testing the market and then going...
and
going away again.
Understandably, because the users, the numbers just weren't there. So back to the hardware. Do you know one upgrade we haven't got, which I really enjoyed reading about, was called the Speculator. Have you seen that?
I have.
We just slot on the side, and it would be a full ZX Spectrum emulator, a ZX Spectrum with 48K. It would only run on the 512 or an expanded 500 because you would need the full 48K available for the Spectrum emulation, and then the overhead on top of that for the emulator. So you would need a little bit more than the 500 alone would offer. And it would come with a tape with a selection of games that you could just run straight off, turn in your MTX into a Spectrum. I imagine by the time you've bought any extra RAM...
Why would you not just buy a Spectrum?
Exactly, why would you not just buy a low-cost Spectrum? But yeah, it's nice that it existed. One of the nice features of the machine, which I read about while learning a bit more about it, was that it does have dedicated video memory. It doesn't have to dip into its main memory for the screen display, which is nice. It gives it an advantage over the likes of the ZX Spectrum. And in terms of audio hardware, it's not great. It's not terrible. It's not badly kitted out in terms of audio hardware, is it?
No, it's very similar to the BBC Texas Instrument, 3 channels plus, I'd say white noise, but they call it pink noise.
Okay. Well, it's not up there with the SID chip in the Commodore 64, but it makes a nice enough sound. And I think the best example of that we found was in one of the games that you loaded up. Which one was that, Keith?
So probably the best one was, and I'm not sure how to pronounce this game, I'm going to call it Quasia.
Okay.
And that's by Megastar Games.
Yeah, and that's programmed by a guy called Chris Sawyer. And you may have heard of him before. Roller Coaster Tycoon, Transport Tycoon. He did a bit of work on games like Frontier Elite and Birds of Prey. A big guy in games programming and game design. And when I looked at, I think it's Moby Games where I sometimes look for programmers' credits, he was credited with games on the MTX back in 1984, but this one wasn't in the list. So add that to your list. Quasia. It's a very early Chris Sawyer game, and this is what it looks like and sounds like. So there you go, that gives you a flavour of what the sound chip is capable of. Maybe there are some better examples you've heard out there. If you're an MTX user, let us know. Is there an MTX demo scene? I don't know. Certainly something worth looking into, but that was the best example we could find from the programs that we had. That was a clone, wasn't it, that game?
Scramble.
Yeah, clearly a clone of the game Scramble, which I struggled with. And then Keith, you did something crazy with the joystick.
Well, you told me that this lovely monster joystick had a switch at the back that turned up into one of the fires. So because you've got to drop the bombs and do the laser, I found if you turn the joystick 90 degrees, and then we could configure it so that we could use it as a 2 button, because of course the joysticks back in those days were only 1.
Yeah, so the MTX really only supports 1 joystick button. Although the joystick is just mapped directly to the keyboard. Isn't it?
Yes.
So if you sit in BASIC and move the joystick around, it just types letters on the screen. Keith had a good workaround and absolutely destroyed my score on that game, making his way all the way into level 2, into the cave, into the pink cave. You did quite well on this game. Yeah. These games that we're playing, they're not of arcade quality. They're not blowing me away in the same way that some later Commodore 64 games did. No doubt that the machine could be pushed further, and we've got a good example of that a bit later. But this was true of all platforms. As people got to grips with the tips and tricks and the undocumented features, they really were able to push it to the limit. So, they're immensely playable games. They're not frustrating me with flickery graphics or horrible sound, but they're also not blowing me away at the same time.
No, but they're not bad showings for what was the first year or so of a computer's life. I remember the sort of machine, the games I used to have to put up with on the Amstrad in its first year.
Games like Roland in the Caves, Animal, Mineral, Vegetable. They're all very simple games. And we had a little go at making a game ourselves, didn't we, Keith? You see, there's 3 programming languages in this. You've got your BASIC, as most of the micros had at the time. It's also got a really nice built-in assembler, including this thing called Panel, which brings up a window which lets you see exactly visually what's happening inside the registers. It lets you scroll through the memory and see what's going on in there. So really quite a nice and powerful feature, that. And then it's got a third programming language called Noddy. Now, Noddy is very much based around text input, making sense of text, and allowing you. It even says in the manual, okay, for those that don't like us showing games to show off machines, it even says in the manual this is a perfect language to create text adventure games with, and we can see its point exactly. So just talk us through what we did with Noddy. We created a couple of screens first of all, didn't we, visually?
Yeah, so you create a screen, you use the cursor keys, you go around, you can place a character anywhere you want.
Yeah.
Then you save that as like a virtual file, and then you have bits of code with the Noddy commands that you can then chain everything together, do some basic if statements and some branch statements and put together.
Yeah, there's very few commands in the Noddy language, but they're perfect for saying wait for an input from the user and then branch off to a different part of the code based on that input in a really nice readable way. And then if you're good at ASCII art, which you were not, as you can see here, this is my attempt at drawing outside the cave, and then it waits for an input, and it says if we type north, it takes us into the cave. That is supposed to be Keith and I sat at the desk. I think it's a great likeness. I'm the one on the right. And then we type south, it branches us back to being outside the cave. So you can see very quickly that you could build up a text adventure game very quickly. It reminds me a little bit of, I used to make text adventures when I was a kid in the Logo programming language. Had a similar set of commands, but it's nice that it's built straight in there.
Well, and the nice thing about Noddy and both that and the assembler is that it can be tied together with the basic program. So you could do a basic program with little bits of assembly for really fast stuff, and then some Noddy bits and bobs, and tie it all together.
Yeah. So you're keeping your code quite readable by having it in BASIC and then breaking out into those other languages. I really like it as a programmer's computer. It's up there, I'd say, with the BBC Micro.
Yes.
You said to me earlier off camera that if this had been put in schools instead of a BBC Micro, you think it would have been just as successful?
I think so.
Just as sturdy. And you haven't had to actually do any work on it, have you, to make it work today? It stood the test of time.
Correct. The keyboard's very similar. I think they're almost identical to the BBC keyboard caps. Not caps.
The switches.
The switches. And sometimes just a little bit of, bashing on the keys just to get them to loosen up, and you're back in.
Yeah, I don't think it's been used for a while, so the keyboard loosened up more and more the more we typed on it just today. So,
and that's just exactly the same as a BBC.
Yeah. Now, there was another program that you ran. Where are we going next with our demonstrations?
For our final game, we're going to look at Surface Scanner.
Okay, let's take a look at that. So this is Surface Scanner. How did you feel about this game, Keith?
Well, I thought this one demonstrated the smooth scrolling very well. We're talking a Defender clone, and another game from Andy Key, so he knows that hardware well.
It's almost like Andy wanted to try his hand at lots of different genres, lots of different popular arcade games at the time, and see if he could do it. And yeah, he's pulled it off pretty well on every occasion.
You would think, though, that he'd be rich beyond his dreams from all these games, but he's stated on his own website that he made only a few £100.
Yeah.
Which he ploughed all the way back into new hardware for himself.
Yeah. As a game, I enjoyed it. I felt, compared to other Defender clones and the arcade game itself, it didn't have as much momentum. When you stopped to turn, there was momentum there. It just stopped very quickly.
Right. You'd have preferred a bit more drift.
Yeah, if it was going to be authentic, but everything else was there. It had the little radar at the top, the scanner at the top. It was a nice game. It was enjoyable to play. So thank you, Andy, for all the games that you've made, because without you, we'd have very little to play, I imagine, on the machine. And then talking about, we'll just carry on with the programming. Text adventures aside, if you wanted to do something a bit more advanced, say with sprites, you discovered something, didn't you?
The basic on here allows you full manipulation of sprites from basic commands, so you don't have to sort of peek and poke your way into a game like you did on the old Commodore 64.
Yeah, or you didn't have to use assembly to play with the hardware sprite registers like on the Commodore 64. You could just do it in BASIC in the same way that you might with Amos or Stos or some of those later languages that gave you that power. So that's a really nice touch. Now let's talk about things that, we've said a lot of the things that we like about it. There were a few things that are not great about it. One thing that stood out to me is the tiny return key over here. You can very easily miss that. Not a biggie. I'm sure you quickly get used to it, and it's not exactly a dead flesh ZX Spectrum keyboard, so we can make exceptions. You can also reset it, can't you, by pressing the two keys, blank keys, I don't know why they're blank, either side of the spacebar, so that gives you a soft reset. Nice to have. I have seen people complain that they can accidentally do that.
Yeah, some people have suggested you take the keycaps off and sort of leave them a bit recessed.
Yeah.
That'd make it look a bit...
It's fine for me. If it ended up in schools, it could be a problem if kids started leaning on the keyboard. And it very nearly did end up in schools. As we said, we mentioned the former Soviet Union earlier. Memotech nearly struck it rich. They had a contract with the Soviet Union to supply 200,000 of these machines with a view to them going into schools, I think it was. Being the Soviet Union, they wanted a few tweaks. Obviously, it had to have Russian language, Russian basic, Russian documentation. And also, brilliantly, they wanted it to be Soviet red in colour. So it would still be the brushed aluminium, but it would be red. Maybe they'd even put a yellow hammer and a sickle on there to give it the complete look. They do exist, don't they?
They do exist. There were some demonstration models in red anodized aluminium. They are rare.
Yeah.
If anybody's got one, we'd love to see some.
Yeah. I know that the chap who lent us a lot of this kit today, it's his dream item, isn't it? To get in his collection.
And Simon, the curator of the museum, says he has seen one in the flesh.
He's seen one. I'd love to see. I think that would be a great looking machine. Maybe we should just spray paint it, Keith. Anyway, the deal fell through. Partly because the Russians, or the Soviets, decided actually they were going to change allegiance and they were going to get MSX computers from Yamaha. So they switched to them. Under the false understanding that they thought that the MSX would have Microsoft's new operating system on there, and it didn't. it was not. I don't know how they've made that mistake, but it left Memotech massively in the lurch, despite having £1 million of British government money to help fund the further development of the machine. They went bankrupt, unsurprisingly, off the back of preparing everything for the Soviet market. So it was a sad demise. But it wasn't unsurprising, really, was it? Because there was a real shake-up in 1984-85.
Nobody expected the crash of '84, where the market just collapsed.
But as with so many computers that we see on this channel, it lived on. And how did it live on, Keith?
From what I've read, from the ashes of Memotech came a new Memotech company that obviously probably bought up all the old stock at not much, and then they interfaced it with a black box controller to create video walls.
Okay, so it almost came back to what the S1 machine originally was, video digitizing. So they used some of their know-how to control video walls. Interesting. And there is another machine down here, actually, and we mentioned that the original prototype was called the S1, and this is the Memotech MTX512 S2.
This one's got more RAM on the main motherboard, so it's got 256k of RAM, and this has the optional 80 column board designed to fit into the case on this one. So on the side here you've got the 80 column video output.
Okay, so by the time this came out, probably the cost of RAM had come down a bit more, so they were able to squeeze that in, and the 80 column mode makes it a really nice all-round business machine, but by the time this came out, I imagine it was flagging somewhat. So hopefully that gives you a slightly more in-depth look than we had when we looked at the 5 micros before and just touched on this. I really enjoyed my day, Keith, getting to know it a bit better. I want one in my collection now more than ever. And I think it would be a really nice idea. In fact, Keith suggested this to me, if we can try and get Andy Key, the name who kept cropping up, on a tea break so he can talk to us about developing for the MTX. If you happen to be watching this, Andy, I'll try and get in touch and hopefully we can have a chat with you, because he's still developing to this day. And hopefully I can show you a clip on the screen now of this train program that you developed, that you sent to me the other night. What's this, Keith?
So this is something that Andy hadn't been doing much, I think, on the Memotech for a little while, programming, but he decided to pick up the programming mantle again in 2016 and created this train game. It looks like 3D graphics on a Memotech, but he's actually using pre-rendered graphics, loading them off almost like Dragon's Lair style.
Oh, okay, that's what it is. Okay.
With the train being chosen because you're on rails, so you can't fly around. You've got to...
Right, so you can. So the video will branch at different junctions on the train track. Okay. It's both impressive and disappointing, because I thought that was all 3D rendered and thought, how is this thing doing that? But at the same time, it's just as impressive that it's streaming video that looks that good. It can fool you in that way. So really nice. Yes, but Andy, love to chat to you sometime if we can. To everyone else, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Thank you to Keith. Thank you to the Swindon Museum of Computing. And I think Keith probably has a thank you to say to you after the last episode, because you picked up about 500 subscribers, didn't you?
At least it didn't quite double my subscriber count, but it got very close. I was expecting to maybe get to 1,000, but we went straight through. Smashed it. So thank you to everyone. Yeah, he went and subscribed to Keith's channel, The Digital Orphanage. All the links are in the video description to everything that we've spoken about today, and perhaps we can get the Enterprise together for another episode in the near future to do the same again. And I know there's a few little fixes that Keith wants to do on this, and you might be doing that on your channel, mightn't you? I want to have a go. There's all the FDX and the SDX. Those need cleaning, refurbishing, bits replacing. It'd be lovely to get them working and get them on display in the museum. Yeah. So that's in store for you if you head over to Keith's channel. And as always, everyone, thank you very much for watching, and take care.
If you enjoy my content and would like to support The Cave while receiving a completely ad-free experience and access to releases 1 week before they go public, then visit patreon.com/retromancave and join the official Cave Dwellers. Thank you for your support.